In sports media, nothing lasts forever. The only constant is change. Mike Soltys was an ESPN employee for 43 years, rising from an unpaid PR intern to vice president in the same department. Imagine how that job changed over that span, from one building in Bristol, Connecticut, to a global brand that included multiple channels, radio, digital, international, a magazine for a while, even sports bars. In 2023, there was another big change for Mike as he was part of a round of layoffs at ESPN. In this episode, we talk about the history of the channel, the challenges of being the PR lead at the worldwide leader, and broader topics on the future of sports media. Plus, sound advice for those considering a career in our industry from someone who's universally respected. Mike Soltys, my guest on Media Credentials.
I demand satisfaction.
My name is Whit Watson, and this is Media Credentials. I'm a sports announcer who's worked a lot of places. This podcast will peel back the layers of sports media and show you how the sausage gets made. Through interviews with industry pros and my own experience, you'll understand why you're seeing what you're seeing and who's responsible for it. Your media credentials have been approved. When I asked Mike Soltys to come on the podcast, he said he was happy to do it, but he asked that we not dwell on his departure from the company, which I can certainly respect. That being said, having been front row for every major ESPN achievement for over 40 years, Mike is a gatekeeper to the company's history, and it is a great story. And luckily, he was gracious enough to share some memories and, equally interesting to me, share some opinions on current trends in sports media. On that topic, there is a dichotomy in sports today that I wanted to explore in this episode. Our collective appetite for content has never been more voracious, and yet we constantly see stories about media outlets cutting back. According to the Cision PR newsletter, there were 20,000 layoffs among all U.S. media companies between January and October of 2023. That's a rate 6 times higher than during the same span in 2022. We've all seen the news about regional sports networks facing financial difficulties and how the NBA, the NHL, and Major League Baseball are trying to counter that. And yet, the day before I recorded this, ESPN announced an 8-year, $920 million agreement with the NCAA to televise 40 championships a year over that span. The NBA is reportedly seeking $75 billion when its media rights come up in 2025. And Fox is said to be eyeing a massive bid for the college football playoffs when that comes up in 2026. So what's really going on? What's happening? If everyone is cutting the cord, where is all this money coming from? Well, no one knows our business better than Mike, so I look forward to asking him. Mike, thanks a lot for taking the time. I appreciate it. I know you've been talking to a lot of people over the last few months, and I will get to some obvious questions about your time at ESPN, et cetera. But first of all, how were the holidays? How are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you, and enjoyed the holidays. We had a lot of time. I in the past few months, also had my first grandchild, and we had Quinn visiting us, so that makes holidays that much more special. My kids I have 4 kids are all adults at this point, but this was the first grandchild.
Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Typically, I like to start by asking guests who work in sports media how they got started and maybe who inspired them. In your case, I think it's an obvious answer once I found out what your dad did for a living. Did you essentially follow your dad's footsteps?
Yes, I grew up. My dad became the sports information director at UConn when my mother was pregnant with me in 1959. And so I grew up around sports information and around UConn athletics. And that happened to be both fortuitous in that I learned so much going to games with my father and watching my dad work. He was basically a one-man show at a time that there were more newspapers in Connecticut than probably anywhere else on earth, and they were all covering UConn. And so it was a great thing to learn there. But fortuitously, ESPN started with Bill Rasmussen wanting to do UConn sports to the state of Connecticut. He originally wanted to do the Hartford Whalers, and they had shot him down, but he wanted to do UConn sports. And that opened the door to rekindling a relationship with my father. And when I was a senior at UConn, I needed an internship, and ESPN had just started, and had a chance meeting in the parking lot of the old field house where UConn used to play basketball with Bill. And as he's like to tell the story, I said the magic words, "I'll work for free." And he brought me down to Bristol as an intern in 1980, and then I never left.
So your dad worked at UConn. You went to school there. You met your wife there.
Correct.
And how many of your kids went to school there?
All four, and my son-in-law and daughter-in-law also. So yes, quite the blue and white family.
Quite the Husky family. Did you ever consider going anywhere else?
Yes, but and a lot of kids growing up in stores do leave. And I actually started at UMass and transferred back to UConn. It was just a common thing that kids in stores didn't want to go to UConn. And then once I got away, I realized that it was a good thing, and fortunately went back.
I'll get back to the ESPN origins in a second, but as someone who grew up there, as you did, I lived there for only 6 or 7 years, although both my kids were born in Connecticut. What is it about central Connecticut that seems to inspire such loyalty? Like you say, people tend to move back, or they just never move away in the first place. What do you think it is about that part of the world?
Yeah, people just really seem to enjoy New England that do stay here. There's people that come in and complain about it and can't wait to get back to wherever they're from, but a lot of people come in and appreciate the fact that, from Bristol, Connecticut on a weekend, you can go to New York, Boston, Cape Cod, mountains, beaches, etc., and there's just so many different opportunities. And I think that, along with just a very kind of comfortable place, but it's a very that New England pragmatic situation, where people just feel that where they're living is very comfortable for them. And as it relates to ESPN, the challenge became for a lot of people after they were there at ESPN a while is that, if you're working a media career in New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago, there's opportunities that you could change jobs without total disruption to your life and your family. If you're working at ESPN, that's a little more difficult. Once NBC kicked up in Stamford, that became a little bit more common, another opportunity. But there really wasn't a great chance for people, to leave ESPN without, uprooting their entire family.
I got asked that question a lot before and after my time. Why Bristol? Of all places in the world, why was it Bristol, Connecticut? And I think you started to answer the question when you mentioned that Bill Rasmussen, he and his son had the idea originally. He was working for the Hartford Whalers at the
Right.
time and needed some inexpensive land to start building this company.
Right.
That's pretty much it, right? I mean, he had to find a cheap place to build, and Bristol was a cheap place to build.
Yes, he got fired by Howard Baldwin, a famous name in hockey and now movie production circles, and started to brainstorm what he could do, and ended up, setting up initially in an office that the local cable company, United Cable, which was kind of if you have Comcast today, back in the day, in many of those homes you would have had United Cable, and they were big in Connecticut, and their local office, they needed a head end for their satellite. They needed a place that there was a good, clear satellite signal, and they found a cheap piece of redevelopment land in Bristol. Bristol had double-digit unemployment at the time, and Bill was renting an office from them before ESPN started in neighboring Plainville, Connecticut. And the United Cable people said, "We only need a fraction of this piece of land. You can buy the rest of it for next to nothing and put your network there." And that's how it started in Bristol versus anywhere else in Connecticut. But Bill was living in Connecticut at the time, where he came from Chicago. He had been in New England for a very long time, and that was kind of the combination: the cheap land plus his connections in the Connecticut sports community.
When ESPN debuted in 1979, satellite technology was not that old. It was still a
No.
relatively new process, wasn't it?
Yeah, one of the reasons why Bill was able to be successful was that he jumped on leasing a transponder from RCA at a time that RCA was having great difficulties leasing them. They leased them to HBO and Ted Turner, and they were doing it on hourly basis for, say, ABC News to send a signal for a report they did on the royal family from London to New York. But they had all this time that nobody wanted on these satellite transponders, and Bill got it. And before ESPN launched, those people woke up to what the possibility of those transponders were, and Bill was getting a lot of offers for them. But that was really the opportunity, was you could get satellite transmission, which meant you could send to the entire country for probably less money than you could send using old-fashioned systems, even locally. And so the 24-hour-a-day concept was born.
When you started as an intern, an unpaid intern, as you mentioned, working for Bill, writing press releases out of a trailer, as you once
Right.
described it, and you also described it as a startup, and many people didn't know that it existed. Yet, one of the initial investors was Getty Oil,
Right.
and one of the first media buys was Anheuser-Busch. They spent
Yes.
$1.5 million on an ad buy, which at the time was the largest buy in the history of cable television. So did somebody know something? Did they think this was going to work?
Well, Bill is still to this day. He's 91 years old. I still talk to him regularly, but a tremendous visionary and also a great optimist and a great salesperson. And he needed money, and he had gone through friends and family, and the investors were burning through it, just trying to start. At the time, there was an oil crisis in America, and Getty was looking to diversify its operations and actually created a division that they did everything from lumbering to Broadway shows to things that just weren't oil. And so it was just good timing that the gentleman at Getty was a big sports fan. Stu Evey was his name, and he gave the green light to invest in it. And then once that happened, he was able to convince both Anheuser-Busch, which was unheard of, but also the NCAA. The NCAA, which ESPN just renewed the deal this week, and I'm thrilled that they did. It's really the longest running for ESPN itself programming deal. And the NCAA, there weren't even the NCAA men's basketball tournament. The early rounds of it weren't televised, and they were excited about the opportunity for exposure. So Bill would negotiate with Getty, Anheuser-Busch, NCAA, different cable systems, all at the same time, using one to suggest that the other was about to sign. You got to get with me. Look at who's coming aboard. And he managed to do all those things and got ESPN off to a pretty successful start because of the fact that he got Getty money, NCAA programming, Anheuser-Busch, which was the leading sports sponsor at the time, to all commit to this upstart network.
Aside from the opportunity down the street from where you lived and where you went to school, and aside from your dad's experience, what was it about sports PR or sports media that was attractive to you?
I really enjoyed on the PR side. I really enjoyed helping the media out and being in the middle of things that they wanted to know about, and which were typically the higher profile things. I saw that with my dad at UConn. I mean, this was pre Big East UConn, and it was exciting when Sports Illustrated fact checked a story that included UConn on a Sunday afternoon. People actually fact checked back then, and I saw that. The relationships he had with writers and the relationships he had with coaches and around athletics, and was very excited about that. The great thing with sports media was just there was always something new going on, and at ESPN that was certainly the case. It was always new programming or new networks, or we opened up restaurants with ESPN zones, and ESPN News, which was where you started with us, was a great thing to provide sports news and press conferences and things to fans around the clock. It just was always changing and always exciting. So never lost sight of that. And though I had a lot of opportunities to look at other places in the 80s and 90s, there was nothing I ever felt that compared to ESPN.
All these years down the road, do you think that the backstory, the Bill Rasmussen story, and the location in Bristol, Connecticut, have added to the mystique a little bit for ESPN?
Yes, I think that it does. It adds. I think it gives a. It's often said that if you're working a shift on Sports Center, you're not then hitting the town in New York City. You're getting out late at night in Bristol, Connecticut, and it lends itself to a very dedicated workforce that is committed to it. But it also, the Bristol became, and the This Is Sports Center promos helped build that kind of funny notion of Bristol being the sports capital of the world. And having a singular. Bill was named when Sports Illustrated at their peak named like the 40 top people of the Sports Illustrated history or something, and Bill was one of them. It just was, this local guy that started. Yes, I think mystique was a good word, and that did help build. Though I think as time goes on, more and more of the people that were involved at the start, there are a few people that are involved on air. Chris Berman, Dick Vitale, Cliff Drysdale are the three that are still there, but there are no longer any employees that were there in 79 and 80. And time rolls on, and that's to be expected. But you did have that common thread, and to a certain degree do still have it with Boomer, Dick, and Cliff Drysdale.
Were you ever intimidated by someone that you met in the course of your job?
Well, early on, when I'm starting at ESPN when I'm 20 years old, I was intimidated often when dealing with top executives or with on-air people. Or I remember going to my first college football game, and Jim Simpson and Paul McGuire were the announcers, and Paul was a very successful NFL punter, and Jim came from NBC, was a legendary broadcaster at that point, and certainly was intimidated there. But then ultimately you find out that people, and I think I lost the intimidation. A couple times over the years when we did an event at the U.S. Capitol around the end of the century and had Muhammad Ali in, and that was along with B-listers Johnny Unitas and Carl Lewis, which in that room, that's the only time those guys are B-listers. But meeting Ali and dealing with him, those kind of things can be a little intimidating. But over time, you just get accustomed to it.
You mentioned the deal with the NCAA, the long relationship with the NCAA that has now been renewed. 8 years after launch, ESPN landed a contract with the NFL. And then a couple of years after that, Major League Baseball in 1990. Was the NFL deal the turning point? Do you think that's what put the channel on the map?
I think the NCAA tournament did because again, it's hard for people to imagine today, but ESPN in 1980, which was the first season of it, is televising the Sweet 16 round and the third place game that existed back then at the Final Four, and immediately was getting attention to it. And the NFL, the other thing before the games became the NFL draft, and that was an idea that primarily Chet Simmons and was pushing with Pete Rozelle, and that established our credentials within the NFL, which then led to the deal in 1987. But clearly the NFL has been, for as long as ESPN existed, kind of the gold standard in televised sports. And so to get your foot in the door, and at that point it was the second half of the season, was a huge thing. What Major League Baseball did for ESPN 3 years later was, time the College World Series was over until the first kickoff of college football, was there wasn't a whole lot of reason to be watching ESPN, and Major League Baseball allowed for a 12-month of the year. There was never a time that you weren't excited about what was on ESPN. In those early days of Major League Baseball, ESPN had 6 games a week, so it was prevalent. And those two deals, yes, were huge parts of the success.
Going back to the NFL draft, wasn't it true that Pete Rozelle was baffled that anybody would want to watch that on television? Wasn't there some pushback initially?
Yeah, that was the story, that he was perplexed by why someone would want to do it. But the story goes that it was also, he was smart enough to know that if somebody wanted to give exposure to his league, that he was willing to do it. And at that point, the NFL draft was on a Tuesday, and it started early in the morning, and so it wasn't even in an ideal window. And if you ever watched the documentary on the 1983 NFL draft that ESPN did and still is available, you see how small the operation was even at that point, 3-4 years into it. And it didn't really explode, for several years, but it did allow ESPN to have its foot in the door, which Chet Simmons early on understood was very important with any of the leagues. If we could, the NHL, we did some games with individual teams, not the league. The Whalers were one of them, the Washington Caps another. Any way to kind of, and we had a small NBA deal, and then the Supreme Court didn't. You could not televise college football games, and there was a Supreme Court decision in 1984 which opened up the door to that. And again, just trying to do anything that showed the possibilities, and certainly after ESPN demonstrated what it could do, it just grew rapidly from there.
Yeah, I'll come back to what's going to happen next in college football a little bit later. But in terms of the day-to-day, what were the biggest challenges for you in your positions?
The biggest challenge, two things, and one that became apparent to me when I had left ESPN was you have to be on every day of the year. And people that work in media and other places don't have nearly the demands of the weekends and the nights, but that's prime time for sports. And also holidays. I mean, you look at what the NBA and the NFL on Christmas Day, and the bowl semifinal and the college football playoff semifinals on New Year's Day. Most people in media, that's a time of year that they're taking off. So the challenge was, that you really never get an off. If you in certain jobs, you really never are off, which is challenging. The other thing for the challenge was just staying on top of so many different aspects of the business, because it wasn't. We were just not just broadcast. We were broadcast. We were cable. We were then internet. We were radio. On and on. We were international. As I mentioned before, we had sports bars. We had products. So you really needed to be an expert on all of those industries, and from a PR end, know what publications mattered in each of those industries.
So surely you had to rely on a lot of people within ESPN to keep track of all of this, right?
Yes, yeah. A great thing about being in the PR field is that you do end up dealing with most people in the company, and that then exposes you to a lot of different possibilities. I spent a lot of time in my latter years dealing with government affairs. Not exactly the thing that you would think at ESPN, but there's relationships with the city of Bristol or the state of Connecticut and things, and was involved in that. And that was an exciting new thing. I keep coming back to ESPN Zone, but I remember the first Zone opened in Baltimore, and what the PR group was worried about was whether the Baltimore Sun food critic would like our cheeseburger. And that was really relevant, because you didn't want just, people are going to come and have a beer and watch a game. You wanted them to bring their family and have dinner. That's how the business was going to succeed. And I was thinking, how the heck did my career become a thing that I'm worried about the Baltimore Sun food critic? And ultimately, the Baltimore Sun food critic loved the cheeseburger at the Zone, so it was a big success.
Let's get to current topics. And you brought up college football, so let's start there.
Yeah.
Could we see a system of promotion and relegation in college football? Could we see maybe Power 5 conferences breaking off and forming their own business unit to go negotiate media rights deals?
Yeah, I think that could be a thing. I think relegation is terrific in European soccer. It could be a very difficult thing to get anyone to agree to that didn't want to be relegated. To me, that's where it would, in the foreseeable future, isn't going to happen. But as we're now going down to a Power 4 and more conferences, kind of being on the outside as it relates to football. Fortunately, they're not on the outside as it relates to men's and women's basketball and many of the other sports. But they certainly are on the outside of. There isn't a realistic chance at this point that a team outside the Power 4 is going to play in the college football playoff. Now, when it expands to 12, you're more likely to get the best one, an SMU or something. Well, they're jumping, but you get my point. The best one of the non-Power 4, and then who knows what would happen from there. But it's going to be increasingly hard, and it will become more and more. It already is. The Power 4 are are the center point, and I think their power in the short term just gets bigger. But long term, you never would have projected 10 years ago that we're at the state that we're currently at. So I read, with this being the last year of the CFP with 4 teams, a lot of historical stories of how it started. And it wasn't that long ago, and the outlook on things was a great deal different. So lots of things change, and certainly in the college space.
There's obviously no decrease in appetite for sports content in this country or elsewhere, but there seems to be a lot of sorting out in terms of delivery and distribution, in terms of how we get the content to the consumer. Do you see that as being the big question going forward for sports media?
It's one of the big questions. I do still think that there's going to be a good home for sports on for the foreseeable future in broadcast television and cable. I mean, it just 2023 just finished, and the only things that in the highest rated events of the entire year on television, yeah, I think it was the Thanksgiving Macy's parade, the State of the Union, and maybe the Oscars. I'm forgetting exactly, but almost everything in terms of a wide viewership is sports. Sports is value in the media ecosystem has never been stronger, but everything is also now becoming a direct to consumer play, where people want to be able to choose specifically what they want to see, and that just changes the ecosystem, which has been so valuable. I mean, Major League Baseball, looking at it now, the Yankees with Yes, the Red Sox with Nesson, and others, have a marked now financial advantage because they have for a long time, but that's even getting more pronounced as many regionals struggle. And so, and that's, as a daily sport, becomes important for them to figure out the direct to consumer and to figure out the economics of it.
Yeah, you just took me to my next question, which was the regional sports network model. What happened? Why is it falling apart now as opposed to any other year?
Well, you had and ESPN belt tightening came from similar circumstances where not that long ago cable television was in 100 million homes, and so, which was close to broadcast television. And then that changed, and a lot of people that were paying their cable bill every month, dropped their cable. And so that was revenue that was going to ESPN that decreased, and that was also revenue that was going to all of the regional sports network teams. So if you were a subscriber to a cable system, you were paying each month for that regional sports network. And even if you weren't a sports fan, or even if you watched 5 Yankee games a year, you were paying 12 months a year. That system hasn't gone away, but it's changed. It's significantly less people, but it's still, ESPN is still making it work. And in certain markets, I just read something with MSG and Yes in New York forming some kind of partnership, which is probably smart for the future, to just be playing in that space, because you don't know where it's going, and when it goes, it can go pretty fast.
Do you think in general we in sports media overstated or understated the importance of streaming? Because that was going to be the next great thing, was being able to watch a game online on your computer screen. And it's kind of going that way, but not to the extent that I think we were led to believe. So what's your opinion on that form of delivery?
I think it's there. I think it's, there are certain sports, I think of European soccer, where if you're a fan, you can see so many things. And certainly in the college space. I mean, I mentioned earlier my UConn fandom. Well, they're in the Hockey East for hockey. Well, I can see all the Hockey East UConn games on ESPN Plus, and there's no way there's an audience that's big enough for a non-streaming platform to do all of Hockey East games. But for the handful of people that want to see it, it's a wonderful thing. And there's so many colleges out there that have fans and alumni, and streaming provides that. I think what people expected was a quicker turn on the dime for ESPN and other places to go exclusively direct to consumer. And that really was not realistic in light of the fact that kind of financial risk that it would put on networks giving up, the cable money that still is there. There are still a lot of people like me that are subscribing to cable,
Right.
and that's still a very lucrative business. It's not the amount of people that it was, 10 years ago, but it's still a lot of people that are writing a big check for me to Cox every month.
And in light of that, ESPN's leadership has been very public in discussing the possibility of taking on an investor or a partner. There are conversations about taking it direct to consumers in the next couple of years, a subscription service on a standalone basis.
Right.
How likely do you think that is?
I think it's very likely, but it's not. I think where it gets misconceived is, or misinterpreted with some people, is the idea that that would be the only way to get ESPN. I think for at least for the foreseeable future, you're going to, when ESPN offers I mean, they already have a direct to consumer with ESPN Plus, but when they start providing ESPN and ESPN2 and the full group of programming that they have, and probably more direct to consumer, it doesn't mean I'm going to then not have an interest in having my Cox cable. They're going to run in parallel paths. They've been very open about that for quite some time, but it would, if ultimately the consumer wants only the ESPN lineup and doesn't want to be paying for all the rest of it, they could have that opportunity.
The new NCAA deal that we mentioned, I saw something that estimates that something between 55 and 65% of the value of that deal is the women's basketball tournament, which represents the enormous upswing in interest in women's sports over the last couple of years. Is there another sport, another segment in sports that you think might be on the rise in the next decade?
I think why a lot of the individual sports, which is why I think the NCAA deal is so important to ESPN. ESPN has televised the women's tournament going back to the mid '90s, and it did, particularly the Final Four did well, but it just exploded recently, and the championship game last year just was higher rated than most sports, not just college basketball, most sports that were on, and to me, social media played a big part of it. America knew who Caitlin Clark was, who Angel Reese was, who Paige Beckers was, and that really helped build women's basketball. And same thing, the WNBA has seen growth because Brianna Stewart and others that are active in social. And I think that same opportunity with sports that are also doing well with individuals, like a gymnastics, or even where athletes that then can sell their individual brand, as we've seen even in college swimming. I mean, there's just an opportunity for athletes to build their individual platform and become well known that didn't exist, 5 years ago. And so you can go into it and be comfortable that who's playing in this game or have a particular favorite athlete. And that really didn't exist in many of the sports that weren't the major professional sports in America.
On the college side, what are your thoughts on name, image, and likeness?
It's got to be figured out. I always thought that the players, coaches would get fired and players couldn't transfer, or players couldn't transfer in the same conference. And it was always, my take was always, the student needs a little more rights in all of this. They're the ones that are ultimately the ones delivering the value. But it's yet to be figured out because, currently, you're seeing what's going on with the recruiting of college football, and there needs to be some kind of rules and system set around it. Whether the NCAA does that, or Congress does it, or the conferences do it, I don't know. But I think it's good that I mentioned the three women's basketball athletes that are so popular on social, and there's others. But I think it's great that they're able to. Paige Beckers is able to do a Dunkin' Donuts spot. That's a great thing.
Right.
Why not? Why shouldn't she take advantage of that? And so, but the kind of bidding for recruits, there needs to be some kind of system around it.
You made an interesting point earlier about having to be on all the time when you were working in sports media at ESPN. Now that you've had some time to reflect and not have to be on all the time, have you thought about what you'd want to do next?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a good 6 months having the opportunity to do things I never really had the time for. I discovered there's this thing called a library card where you can get media for free.
Wow.
And yeah, it's quite a concept. I think it'll catch on, and you can borrow these things called books. And so, I got into that world. I've been happy watching sports. You end up when you're in the business watching it in a different way. I was delighted to watch the Sugar Bowl and have a woman flash on Bourbon Street to the cameras and not have to say, "Oh, my next 3 days are ruined," and just
Right.
and just enjoy the Sugar Bowl. I have through my career been very active in community things. I've been the board chairman for the soup kitchen in my town, Southington, Connecticut, and Bread for Life, and for about 10 years. And I've been involved with an organization called Youth Journalism International, which is a small organization that deals globally with students that have an interest in getting in journalism and getting to know fellow students around the world and join their board and hoping to help them grow. I'm keeping my mind open to new possibilities. I'm very much interested in things that interest me or excite me, but um, just keeping an open mind and in the meantime, just enjoying the opportunity to do things like taking hikes and bike rides and trips to the beach and things that were problematic when, I can be heading to the beach on Labor Day and, have Mike McCarthy at Front Office Sports call me about some lawsuit. And like, I don't miss those days being behind me.
I generally like to ask this question in case there are students who find the podcast who are considering careers either in broadcasting or in some other kind of media. If you were to give advice, and I'm sure you're asked this question a lot, to someone who's considering entering the industry now, what would you tell them?
I do over the years, particularly at UConn because being my connections there and spoke there a good deal, did some mentorship things and stuff that often got that. And some things changed over the years, but there was a common message that delivered for 40 years. I'd still deliver today is one, whatever end of the media you want to go and work on your writing. There's a lot of kids in college that don't want to work on their writing. It's going to help you. No matter whether you're working on social media or you want to be a sportscaster and you're writing lead-ins or you're going to work in PR, work on your writing. But the other thing is it's so competitive to get your first job, and the first job, getting that first job can be a real vault to a good career. It's so competitive though with the amount of kids in college that want to go into it that you have to right away when you get into college is start getting the experiences, whether that's the school paper, television station, social media account, or for PR, a local PR firm, whatever it may be. People that are applying as seniors in college to jobs in sports media already have this very detailed resume, and that's who you're competing with. And so it gives you the experience, it gives you an understanding of what's out there, but it also gives you connections that you can reach out to. And in the last 5 years, the advice is morphed also into is have a LinkedIn presence. It's so much a hiring and so many opportunities are coming through LinkedIn. And not just for somebody coming out of college. I've said that to a number of my colleagues, that are wondering what happens if someday they're shown the door. And it's like, just make sure your LinkedIn presence is there because that's where the opportunities are going to come from.
In just a few seconds, we'll have some closing thoughts on this episode, so stay tuned. If you're enjoying it so far, please consider subscribing or sharing and leave a review. Let me know what you'd like to hear in the future on Media Credentials. Mike didn't miss when he talked about the dominance of the NFL. 93 of the 100 most watched broadcasts on U.S. TV in 2023 were NFL broadcasts. I loved his comment about the magic words that got him the internship. I'll work for free. I've always said something similar about my time at ESPN. When ESPN News launched in late 1996, the company was looking for young, cheap talent. At the age of 25, I was both young and cheap. I worked for ESPN for 6.5 years between 1997 and 2003, and it was a privilege. I only left because I had the chance to move home to Florida and take on some roles outside of the studio. I do wish I had gotten to know Mike a little bit better during my time there. In prepping for this episode, I was struck by how respected and admired he is by former colleagues and members of the media. In a way, it's aspirational. I'll leave you with these words from legendary ESPN broadcaster Chris Berman. Quote, I personally find it impossible to think of ESPN and those who contributed to making us great without thinking of Mike Soltys. Thanks again for listening to Media Credentials. For examples of my work, including video and audio clips, a blog, and my contact page, check out whitwatson.com.